5.
It was more like being in a bread queue for no bread than it was being in a healthcare environment.
4.
The IOC still run the Olympics for the IOC and not for the athletes, and that's something I would very much like to see change.
3.
If Labour come in and impose lots and lots of regulations, which their backbenchers want and trade unions want, they're going to seriously hurt growth. They're not going to foster growth.
2.
I've been saved by Almighty God, Halligan.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. It's meant to be the silly season, Allison. Newspaper pundits like us should be talking about the weather, campaigns to save abused donkeys, and cloud formations, or even pieces of toast that look like the face of Jesus. But, dear co-pilot, and it's great to have you back, the news, real news, not holiday morsels, is instead coming thick and fast. Prime Minister Keir Starmer faced Rishi Sunak for his first PMQs, and already Labour rebels are coming to blows with the government. The Tory leadership race has begun, with not so much a bang as a whimper. A timetable of sorts has been published, but only one candidate, or maybe one and a half, has so far dared to declare. Over in the States, Joe Biden's finally made way, knocked down, not on this occasion, Allison, by the proverbial feather, but by the surge in support for Donald Trump as voters across Trump's base, the disenchanted blue-collar classes in the southern Bible Belt, don themselves with weird ear bandages, many now convinced that the Donald, as he inadvertently dodged the would-be assassin's bullet, was saved by God. And by God, Allison, there's a lot to talk about, not least your recent visit to A&E.
I've been saved by Almighty God, Halligan.
God big. Like the sheriff in Deputy Dog. Remember when he talked, his sort of moustache moved up and down. He didn't have a mouth. He just had a moving moustache.
Well, being saved by God was the only alternative because the NHS wasn't going to do anything about it. Yeah, I've poured out my heart and experience in my Telegraph column this week. It was a week ago today, because of course I was building up to recording Planet Normal with you, and I had a very packed schedule of interviews and so on, and woke up with very severe chest pains, and then unfolded a series of unfortunate events. And it was very scary, but it was also not just personally scary because of the immense pain, but to witness the complete collapse of the NHS emergency system firsthand. I mean, we get a lot of emails, don't we, Liam, from people who've fallen foul of hospital ineptitude and cruelty. But I was there, watching it. And it's pretty upsetting, really. And I did think after the hundreds of thousands I'd paid in income tax that possibly a cup of tea and a shot of morphine might have been something that I was owed. But it's really extraordinary. Something's gone terribly wrong when people who are in a caring profession basically walk over people who are lying on a floor. Patients are not regarded as feeling human beings. We're just there to be processed and not to be processed very adequately. And I said in the column that it was a kind of a glimpse of a sort of socialist Soviet system, really. It was more like being in a bread queue for no bread than it was being in a healthcare environment. We just have to change it, Liam. We have to. We can't go on like this. I mean, hundreds of people there, hours after hours. In fact, there were a few funny interludes because lovely chap next to me was just covered in blood. His shirt was just covered in blood. And he said he'd had a nosebleed. And I said, nosebleeds can be very serious. And he said, Genghis Khan died of a nosebleed. Which I thought was one of those surreal things that someone says to you. And he said to me,
how did I not know that?
Yeah, how did you not know that? I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing, And I haven't looked it up because I don't want it to be not true. So the guy with the nosebleed said, how long to me? And then I said 4.5 hours. And then he said 6 hours. And then the chap opposite, sort of silver fox, lovely Eastern European guy, said 8.5 hours. So it's basically top trumps of how long have you been here? And all the clinical staff are behind these swing doors, completely separate from the patients. And every so often one will come out and shout, Jeremy Lewis, and is there a Jeremy Lewis? And so few people came forward. And I thought, well, they've probably all gone home to die, haven't they? That was my sort of frontline report from a very, very sick system.
Well, it's great you're back and fighting fit. And it is an extremely powerful read, your column this week. And the link to that, of course, is in the show notes to this episode.
Before we move on, can I just say, just before we started, the National Audit Office has said that the NHS is broken. Spending more money has not improved care or productivity. And the National Audit Office recommends a, quotes, fundamental rethink of the model of healthcare to meet the needs of an ageing population. So that's a pretty neutral body, isn't it, Liam? That's not a kind of particularly politically controversial group, is it?
On the contrary, it's not only not political, it's extremely authoritative. The NAO isn't a sort of random think tank funded by, some well-meaning corporate types. The NAO is the government's own internal auditor of spending and broader policy. And for the NAO to write a report, and I agree with you, it's a really astonishing report, a very strong language like that will have been through the hands of many people within the public sector. So we so often we have, anonymous doctors and anonymous civil servants briefing newspapers saying, oh, it's all so terrible and we just need more money. And then you have the NAO, which is, it's not nearly as powerful as it used to be. It was seriously denuded during the new Labour years, I'm afraid to say. And I saw that happen with my own eyes. But it's still a very powerful body, the government's own auditor, the government's kind of in-house, not so much fiscal conscience, because that's the OBR. And I do think the OBR is politicised, by the way. I do think the OBR does have a kind of what economists might call a Keynesian groupthink in its attitudes in many ways. But the NAO isn't like that at all. The NAO is full of policy nerds and accountants looking at value for money. And this is a debate that's going to go on and on. And that brings us on to public sector pay.
Yes.
Because we've just had these public sector pay figures coming out of the independent pay review body. And the pay review body has recommended an increase of 5.5% for teachers and some NHS workers. That's what we understand. But already Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, is out of the block signalling that will be a floor for what the government eventually awards rather than a ceiling. She may give public sector workers pay rises that are even more above inflation, though, of course, real wages have been denuded in recent years by inflation. But that's happened a lot more in the private sector than it has in the public sector. And a lot of people in the private sector, 4/5 of all workers, a fifth of us work for the state, they're going to be lucky to get 5.5%.
Well, also, is it not the case that productivity in the public sector has been falling and has not bounced back since the pandemic in the way that it has in the private sector?
I love it when you talk productivity.
I'm highly trained. You know me.
That's exactly right. And this will have implications for the private sector as well, because sometimes private sector employers have to compete with public sector employers. And I don't think that inflation is nearly tamed enough to give public sector workers, so many people involved, an above inflation pay rise. Look, I want everybody to have as good a standard of living as we can. But if inflation rears its ugly head again, and there are lots of reasons why it might, Allison, then everyone's going to be worse off. I wrote in last week's Telegraph about the World Container Index, the cost of shipping freight around the world. That's gone up fourfold since the beginning of the year per container because of all the geopolitical risks and so on, and the knock-on impact on insurance costs and boats having to go all the way around the Cape of Africa rather than going through the Suez Canal to Europe and so on because of armed militias, frankly. And there are other reasons why inflation could go up, not least continuing high service sector inflation, which is mainly wage inflation because services are labour intensive. And I think this is quite rash if Rachel Reeves does go through with this. She wants to do a big kind of bold gesture in order to mollify Labour voters across the economy, many of them, of course, in the public sector. But I think this could backfire in economic terms.
Before the election, there was making a huge thing of this commitment to fiscal discipline, weren't they? And it's taken barely 3 weeks for the whole thing to start to fall apart. And we've also had this row, similarly, about the two-child benefit cap. And now we're starting to wonder how long before Labour ditches that cap as well, which is going to mean billions more, isn't it? And I think Starmer has suspended, hasn't he, several of the sort of far left MPs who voted against the cap. I mean, where are these billions coming from, Al? It's the sixpences down the back of the sofa again, isn't it?
1 billion, 2 billion, pretty soon you're talking about serious money. Yes, 7 Labour MPs voted for an SNP amendment selected by the Speaker, which tried to end the cap on child benefit and other benefits beyond 2 children. This was seen as quite a controversial policy at Westminster when it came in, but it is, guess what, very popular across the public as a whole. I do think that in the end, Labour will lift this cap, but they're quite happy for now not lifting it. One, because that's what a lot of the public wants, that's worried about Labour raising taxes and raising public spending and so on. But also because it wants to be seen to be controlling the left of the party, all those mass-ranked MPs in the Labour Party. Many of them are members of the campaign group, what Labour whips call rather unedifyingly the awkward squad. And for Rachel Reeves in particular, but for Keir Starmer too, it'll do them no harm in the eyes of the bond markets and investors looking to see how they're going to manage the economy. Are they going to borrow and spend recklessly? If they have this high-profile row about this two-child benefit cap for a while, that will do them a power of good.
I was actually looking up the history of it, and it was actually introduced, the two-child benefit cap, in the budget of 2015 by George Osborne, who was then the Chancellor. And that was very much part of the sort of austerity programme, wasn't it, Liam? Trying to rein in sort of credit and get spending back to the sort of 2007, 2008 levels. And George Osborne said that they wanted to go from a high welfare, high tax economy back to a low tax and a low welfare economy. And since then, I mean, the welfare budget is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? It's just, I don't know. I mean, are we going to sink? I mean, if we've got, 100% our sort of debt is kind of basically 100% of GDP. How much financial trouble do you think we could be in?
Well, at the moment, our debt to GDP, as you say, the total national debt is the same as the size of GDP. And that's the number everyone uses, sort of debt as a share of GDP. It's a bit of a weird thing. Here's a Velma moment, ready? Except I'm going to do the Velma thing. When you compare debt to GDP, it's kind of comparing apples and pears, because the GDP is a figure in 1 year, all the transactions in the economy and production in 1 year. Debt is paid off over many years. But it does still give you a sense. We're not actually among the worst countries when it comes to debt to GDP. You know, the French, they're up at 120, 130% of GDP. The Italians, 140, 150. The Americans have got lots of debt, but of course they can borrow more easily because they can print hard currency. They can print dollars. We're okay under 2 conditions. One, that Labour doesn't go completely nuts when it comes to borrowing and spending, or they will be reined in by financial markets, and Rachel Reeves and Liz Truss's names will become synonyms in the eyes of the financial markets. So as long as they don't go nuts, and that's why Rachel Reeves is having this performative row with the left about the two-child benefit cap and drawing fire onto herself to show the markets that she can take this fire from the left. And the other condition is that we actually get some growth. The best way to lower your debt as a share of GDP, which then allows you to borrow more cheaply, those lower borrowing costs spread across the economy once the government can borrow more cheaply because there's less debt as a share of the overall economy, is to grow, is to expand the economy. And the trouble is, if Labour are going to come in and whack loads of taxes on things, if Labour are going to come in and make employers' jobs more difficult to employ people, more regulation and so on, if Labour come in and impose lots and lots of regulations, which their backbenchers want and trade unions want, however justified they may feel, they're going to seriously hurt growth. They're not going to foster growth. Similarly, if Labour's plans to free up house building and so on and get a building boom going, if they get caught in regulatory and legal thickets, then they are not going to encourage growth. Labour have got it right. They need to encourage growth, just as Liz Truss said, for all the flack thrown at her. But I can't see anything so far in this Labour offer that will encourage growth, with the exception of house building, which is very controversial if done at scale, and may also not happen because of the legal obstacles and the planning obstacles that have to be overcome.
You know, I've got slightly mixed feelings about this child benefit cap, really, because it's hugely important to mums. You'd be surprised. I think listeners would be shocked when I've been interviewing women, even quite well-to-do women. A lot of men are just not passing on money to the mums. And that little bit of child benefit, or what, when my mum was out there going to the post office every week for family allowance.
Yeah, I remember that.
That was to eke out some little things, for your children. And in other countries, they incentivize parenthood in the tax system. And our birth rate is dropping. We are importing huge numbers of people. Part of the unpleasantness of my experience in A&E was there are too many healthcare staff with poor English and quite hostile or attitudes that don't fit in with what we like. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, 3 very cheery paramedics who were just keeping us going, joking and so on, laughing and joking and just keeping my spirits up. Very different picture in A&E, where you don't get quite a lot of people not native English speakers. And so we've got this conundrum because we're not incentivizing people to have children. My daughter's in her late 20s now. She's saying many of her friends can't imagine ever having kids because they can barely afford to rent somewhere.
Finally on this, Alison, I'd say I agree with you. I'm queasy about this 2-child benefit cap as well, because that really will hurt people at the sharp end. Look, if I was Rachel Reeves and I was choosing between lifting the 2-child benefit cap on the one hand, which costs a few billion, or giving public sector workers an above inflation pay rise, which will cost many billion, I'd go for the 2-child benefit thing. But the difference is absolutely all day long, as they say in Sunday League matches in Hackney Marshes, as in we'll beat them all day long. But the difference is, Alison, that single mums struggling to get their maintenance off the fathers of their children, absolutely with you. They're struggling, but they're not going to go on strike, and they're not going to cause headlines, and they're not going to knock the shine off Keir Starmer's government in this first year. But very belligerent public sector unions, and there's still over 50% union membership across the public sector, by the way. And many of the public sector union leaders are very much from the aggressive end of the political spectrum compared to recent years. If they go on strike, then that is really going to unnerve Labour, and you could have real turmoil within the Parliamentary Labour Party, even within the cabinet. And that is Keir Starmer's worst nightmare, public sector strikes.
Well, it was a big day today. We're recording on Wednesday because it was Keir Starmer's first Prime Minister's Questions, wasn't it? How did you think he did, Liam?
I was tuning in, as Nicholas Parsons used to say when people used to sort of turn a little dial on their televisions.
I still call it the wireless, mate. I'm not.
Tune in. I tuned in for Clash of the Titans and I got the clangers. It was very herbivorous, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's what it was.
You know what I disliked about it? So Rishi Sunak has led the Conservative Party off a cliff, right? He's lost hundreds of Tory seats. And whatever you think of the Labour government, it's going to introduce some changes which are going to affect lots of people's lives, and I think very adversely. To take one example, they're going to bring in this conversion ban, which is going to make it easier for woke teachers to lure confused teenagers down the path of gender dysphoria. So there's lots of consequences of that terrible battering Tory defeat. And there's Starmer in the Commons doing his jokey, I'm such a lovely bloke, nice statesman me. And I was thinking, I will reach out across the House. I'm glad to hear the Prime Minister say that. Let's all talk about Ukraine. And I just, obviously my I was just going to say I could feel the bile rising in my throat, but that's been happening since I was in hospital. But I just thought, this is the thing I dislike about politics. They're not serious, Liam. Sunak is fundamentally not serious. I mean, he should really be in the metaphorical sackcloth and ashes now, but it's all joshing, everybody laughing around him. Oh, what jolly good bloke. And I was actually thinking, you're the leader of the opposition now, temporarily. The idea is to oppose. You don't just stand there and burnish your own character. I'm not saying it very well, probably. I really dislike that sort of collegiate, no one can really talk about what's happened, which has been a huge rejection of the Conservative Party. And now we're looking, obviously, we have the leadership contest, the date, the sort of parameters of that have been laid down, and we will have a new leader of the opposition on the 2nd of November. Now, I had a former minister telling me about this WhatsApp group for senior Conservative insiders. It was quite astonishing, Liam, the degree of denial amongst these people. I mean, if you or I had suffered a setback, as happened on the 4th of July, we might think we'd done something wrong, mightn't we? We might have thought, that hasn't gone very well, but apparently no. And we heard on the Today programme, one of the first out of the traps is James Cleverly, the former Home Secretary, issuing a rather glossy video about his background and so on. And James Cleverly literally was saying that, that our successes didn't cut through, right?
It's all about the communication strategy. I knew. If only they'd hired a good PR man or woman.
If only we'd been more unified.
Yeah.
And if only our successes didn't cut through. Can we have 2 seconds silence while the country tries to think of some of the Conservative successes that didn't cut through? It's literally. So I just think if the people coming forward, at least from Suella Braverman so far, and Robert Jenrick, to his credit, we have seen an admission that they have totally cocked up. I suppose what I wanted to ask you really was, are the Conservative MPs, however many other 121 of them now, are they going to choose a leader which will flatter them and their own sort of internal psychodrama? Or are they going to pick a leader who is going to address why 4.5 million people, former Conservative voters, many of them, voted for reform?
And many others stayed at home, of course. And as this debate goes on, and so far, only James Cleverly has declared. Tom Tugendhat sort of half declared, very much from the sort of One Nation, more left-wing part of the Conservative Party. Priti Patel on the right of the party, but very much positioning herself as somebody on the right that the One Nation Tories can do business with. Everybody's waiting for Kemi Badenoch to declare, of course. That hasn't happened as of the time of this recording. But watching this kind of psychodrama with the Tories literally fighting for control of the tiller, do they steer to a point on the horizon that's to the left of where they are, trying to take on Keir Starmer, or do they steer to a point on the horizon which is to the right of where they are, towards planet reform? And there is Nigel Farage in the Commons giving his first Commons speech, his maiden speech, obviously one of the most articulate politicians of his generation. He was remarkably, I thought, controlled and low key. There was none of the sort of bombastic stuff that you'd see, that, the YouTube clips of him in the European Parliament, the clips that made him famous, the clips that launched UKIP, the clips that ultimately led to Brexit. Farage, of course, was one of the first politicians in the world to stick, his own speeches on YouTube. At the time, everybody thought it was mad. Tens of millions of views later, and he'd call the new president of the European Commission, "Who are you? Who are you? You've got the looks of a low-grade bank clerk and the charisma of a damp cloth." I mean, that's how he would attack his political opponents. And after the pub viewing went on YouTube, it was pretty good. But he was, I thought, remarkably respectful and low-key and even deferential in his House of Commons speech. It's worth watching just for the kind of anthropology of it. The main issue he went on was actually Brexit. And he said, this is a parliament of Remainers. the cabinet is a cabinet of Remainers, really highlighting that his concern, maybe he's paranoid. Many people would say that he is. His concern that Keir Starmer is going to try and not just reset our relations with Europe, as he said ad nauseam since he entered Downing Street, but actually legally change the current arrangement, moving us back towards European Union membership in some shape or form. This week's guest is Sharron Davies, making a return to Planet Normal, having previously appeared in February 2021 and July 2023. Sharon's new book, Unfair Play, The Battle for Women's Sport, is out now in paperback just ahead of the Paris Olympics, which begin this weekend, and at which Sharron will be in her rightful place, helping to cover the swimming events on BBC television. Sharron Davies is, of course, a swimming legend, the double Commonwealth champion who so cruelly missed out on Olympic gold, as did some of her compatriots, due to the blatant doping of East German athletes in the 70s and 80s. More recently, Sharron's waged a long campaign against biological males being allowed to compete directly against women under the guise of trans self-ID, which Sharron and many other elite athletes, including Martina Navratilova, have argued passionately against, being dubbed transphobes, bigots, and much worse for their trouble. Sharron's book, Unfair Play, which she's written with journalist Craig Lloyd, also gives us a grand sweep of the history of women's sports, including the struggle for women to be included at major events, not least the Olympics. Sharron Davies has been to a dozen Olympic Games as a competitor and a commentator. As she heads to Paris, I asked her, is she excited?
Yeah, always, always. I mean, it's come around so quickly because, of course, it's only been 3 years since...
Because of COVID.
Exactly. So it does seem a little bit quicker, but then it's also a bit odd because we've had all the presidential stuff from America, all the election stuff here in the UK, then the Wimbledon, then the football. So normally we have a big build-up. This year it's been about a week.
We need to talk about your book and the Olympics and the history of the Olympics. I learned so much about how women were treated as the Olympics began.
I know. De Coubertin did everything in his power to keep us out.
He's the founder of the modern Olympics, right? Pierre de Coubertin.
Yeah. And in fact, for quite a long time, they did everything they could to keep women out. And if we had women that were in the first swimming competitions from Australia, they would stick them on a boat and the men were allowed to train on deck. They would create some sort of pool for them. The women just had to stay in their cabins under chaperone. I mean, there's all sorts of ridiculous things that have happened. And even when I first started competing, Paris for me is my 13th consecutive Olympic Games.
Crikey.
There were 4 men to every woman. So things have definitely got better, but the IOC still run the Olympics for the IOC and not for the athletes. And that's something I would very much like to see changed.
In 1900, I learnt from you, there were just 2 women's events at the Olympics and 95 events for men.
I know, it is mad, isn't it? We've had this incredible disparity for absolutely ever. And in fact, we still have, Iliam. There's 1,000 women in the UK that earn their living from sport. There's 11,000 men, right? And those 11,000 men earn a darn sight more, as you can imagine, because that includes Premiership footballers. And an awful lot of that 1,000 women happen to be lottery funded as well, which is the great, wonderful general public doing that. So, the disparity is still absolutely huge, which is why I had to speak out, because we constantly had this history of battles throughout the whole modern Olympics. And even now, after everything that happened with the East Germans, when they were giving these young East German girls testosterone and they dominated, now we have males with testosterone that are doing the same thing. And I just couldn't sit by and watch it happen again. I just couldn't.
When you were researching this book, is there anything you learned about those days of doping? Because you present it in tremendous detail. There's an awful lot of research that yourself and Craig Lloyd have put in. Was this a voyage of discovery for you writing that part of the book?
Not really, because obviously I knew most of that. And I did a documentary when the wall came down in 89 for Channel 5. And we went to Germany. I met a load of East German athletes. I met a load of doctors. I went to the old Stasi building. I was able to see documents in the Stasi building. We knew at the time there was just no way that they would be able to bring female athletes out of the woodwork that we'd never seen on the international stage, arrive at an Olympics, smash world records, take numerous 1, 2, 3s on the podiums, and have no success practically in the men's events. It was impossible. That doesn't happen. So everybody knew that they were cheating. We just didn't know why they weren't being caught and why the IOC wasn't doing more about it. I think some of the shocking things were things like abortion clinics in training centres. where it wasn't a matter of the girls falling pregnant by other swimmers. It was girls being abused and falling pregnant from coaches and administrative and security. And it was literally a building built inside of their training camp to accommodate this. And it was such a secret. And then things like the GDR team being kept on the St. Lawrence in the river, the St. Lawrence in the 76 Olympics, away from everybody else. Afterwards, they dredged up all of these needles and substances, and nothing over and over and over was done about it. It just was allowed to happen for 20 years, and whole generations missed out. I don't know if you remember Kathy Cook. Still I think the second fastest time by any British athlete over 400 metres, only beaten by Christina Horrigo a few years ago when she won the World Championships. Kathy never won any major championships other than Commonwealths when the East Germans weren't there, pretty much like me. And so Kathy then, when she finished her career, went off to be a school teacher. And there's so many people whose whole lives would have been different if they'd won the medals they should have won. And I just thought, well, it is different, but it's the same. It's still testosterone. This was artificial testosterone. Now it's real testosterone. So I just can't watch as another generation potentially lose out. I just have to speak out. Even if I can't do anything, I have to speak out.
Just tell me succinctly how a generation has lost out, is losing out across all sports, but particularly in your sport of swimming, and what really mobilised in you the determination to speak out as you have, drawing a lot of fire, a lot of abuse towards yourself.
Yeah, there's a very small, very, very loud, very aggressive minority who really can't take a challenge, aren't interested in a debate, aren't interested in the science or the voices of competing athletes. Just trying to get governing bodies to poll their athletes was really difficult. And you'd have thought that would have been the first stage, wouldn't you? The science, and then to ask their members what they think. And not a single female athlete has been asked by the IOC, even to this date. They've not asked female athletes what they think about the fact they've thrown away their sport and they no longer offer fair sport to female athletes. And for the IOC to take the stance that we have to presume there's no benefit, basically says there's no benefit to being male. Well, then why on earth do we have men and women's categories if there's no benefit? And everybody knows there's a biological difference between male and females. Every single result and record since the beginning of time shows us that. So it's a ludicrous position to take, but that is the position that they took. That, there's no difference. Well, that's crazy. So I'm quite proud of World Aquatics because they, after World Rugby, did a very transparent policy. They did a big report. They worked with the science. They did actually ask their swimmers. They voted on it. And very overwhelmingly, they said, no, we want to protect the female category. So we do have protection in aquatics, in cycling, in track and field, in rugby. But there are still many sports in the Olympics where we don't, including combat sports, which I find horrifying.
Just update our Planet Normal listeners, Sharon, on the case of Leah Thomas, a Melbourne swimmer who won US Intercollegiate Championships in the female category, of course, an extremely high level, a feeder to Olympic teams. As in those female categories, you wrote that Leah Thomas has more guilt than the abused ranks of East Germans, those GDR swimmers that were doped. Thomas has said in returns, I don't need anybody's permission to be myself and do the sport that I love. This is getting really nasty.
Yeah, the reason I say that, though, is because those East German girls had no choice in the matter. A lot of them were given testosterone at 11 and 12 years old, and that testosterone did terrible things to them. Many of them have died. Most of them are very poorly. Some of them had disabled children. There was a lot of court cases when the wall came down, which gave them some sort of compensation. But really, they just faded into the background and were told to get on with their lives, extremely poorly. And that's where they are. Whereas Leah Thomas competed till they were 22 years old as a man. And you said was born a man. They are still a man. Human beings cannot change their biological sex, okay? So he's still male, right? Whatever he chooses to identify as, he is still male. So this 6'4" distance freestyler then decided to transition. 1 year later was beating 3 USA Olympic silver medalists in events that he wasn't even very good at. So this is a bit like Mo Farah deciding he wants to run the 100. And beating all of the women from Jamaica. That's how ridiculous it was. For us, it was a good thing in a way because it really brought it to the attention of everybody how ridiculous this was. And I think that helped our case. But we shouldn't have to have a Leah Thomas in every sport to do the absolute obvious.
It's fair to say, isn't it, Sharon, that quite a lot of major sports have now started to change their tune, having adopted blindly a lot of the nostrums of the trans lobby. More recently, some of them have been putting corrective measures in place, in your view, haven't they?
Yeah, no, they have. I mean, World Aquatics, track and field, World Cycling, so the big three at the Olympics have, but things like volleyball hasn't, football hasn't. I mean, there are still more sports in the Olympics that don't protect their female athletes than do. And then the IOC just a few weeks ago gave an instruction to all the world's media that we weren't allowed to use the word biological male, biological female, transgender woman, transgender man, trans-identifying woman. So basically we were instructed we weren't allowed to tell the truth. I will not do this. I will not lie. We have to find a place in sport for everybody, but we cannot turn around and say to young women and girls, they're just not worthy of fair sport anymore. To me, that's atrocious when we've come so far, but yet we're still so far behind what men get.
This book, if I may say so, it's the end result of quite a long process, a journey that you've been on. We interviewed you here on Planet Normal back in 2020, and the fact that you were giving that interview, it was really quite controversial what you were saying, because there were far fewer people of your prominence and sporting caliber who were saying those things. But it must have come at a personal cost, even for someone as tough and famously resilient as you.
You know what? I honestly think the cost of not speaking would have been worse. If there's an injustice going on and you don't say anything, then you have to live with that injustice and the result of it, really. And I'm a grandma now. I have a granddaughter and I have a daughter who did track and field. So I feel that I can't pull the drawbridge up behind me and carry on celebrating my medals when females coming behind me might find it extremely difficult to do that. So it was about, not being able to live with myself if I didn't speak. And because of the East German thing, I had this real experience of what testosterone did and how dominant it was. In Moscow, for example, East Germany had 6 podiums. 6 1, 2, 3 podiums. They were winning things like 80% of the women's medals. And can you imagine, that was just one country. This is now every country that will be allowing males to identify into women's sport across every single sport. So the potential of it being thousands and thousands of women that will lose out is very real.
How's it been for somebody like you to be called a transphobe, to be called a bigot? I mean, I've even seen you on social media being called, and it's quite absurd, you've got mixed race children, a racist. Anyone that knows anything about you beyond the fact that you're a brilliant swimmer would just know how ridiculous that is.
And I think that's probably what makes it, I can cope with it much better, because I know it is ridiculous. It's a tactic. It's a tactic purely to shut anybody up who doesn't go along with the narrative. And so I have got to the point now where it just washes off my back, really, because it is a way to try to make you be quiet. It means nothing. And it's a shame, because these words are important. We need to be honest. If someone's a misogynist, we'd be able to need to use it properly. If someone is a racist, we need to be able to use it properly. But we've got to a place now where everybody who doesn't, disagrees with you will just throw these abusive words out to try to blacken someone's reputation, so it makes their life really, really difficult. And this has got to stop. We've got to be able to have respectful debate that's based on science and goodwill. And if you've got a strong case, there is no reason for you to be frightened of debate. It's only people that don't have a strong case that really don't want to listen to the science or don't want to listen to anybody else, as I know you are. But I'm a huge defender of free speech and democracy, and they go hand in hand. We don't have free speech, we won't have democracy.
Now, women's sport is generally on the rise, garnering more attention. At least that's the broad impression, not least the prominence now enjoyed by women's football and cricket. But again, reading your book, you counter my previous thinking. I mean, I grew up in the 70s. I remember the East German onslaught, but reading the statistics you put there really brought it home. And it's the same when it comes to women's sport. You argue very convincingly that in many senses there's now a lot less women's sport on TV than there used to be.
Yeah, there really is. That is very much a misconception. So yes, women's football is getting a lot more airtime. And then you mentioned a bit of women's cricket and definitely a bit more of women's rugby. So women's team sports that have predominantly been very strong men's sports areas, they are getting a bit more airtime. Still very little in comparison. Women get about 4% of the primetime airtime and 2% of the sponsorship dollar. That's all we get, right? So men get 98% of the money that floats around in sport goes to men.
The swimming stars of today, with huge respect to them, the likes of Adam Peaty, of course, Lauren Cox, who just became the first female swimmer to win an individual championship since 2015, I think. They're not nearly as famous as you were in 1976. And yet we've got swimmers today who, if anything, are outperforming them. They don't have the profile that you guys had.
We used to have those two wonderful vehicles for sport, World of Sport and Grandstand on a Saturday afternoon. But now we don't. Last year we had the World Swimming Championships in Tokyo again, and they didn't even make it onto primetime television. They were on the red button on the BBC. Last year was the first year I've ever known in 50 years being involved in elite sport where our major event wasn't on television.
Same with athletics, isn't it? Same with athletics. I mean, everybody knew Fatima Whitbread was and Tessa Saunderson, and they were two javelin throwers, and they were household names. They were doing one field sport.
My point is that we knew lots of women across different sports. We know maybe a few football women, but we don't know an awful lot else. We might every 4 years, watch a cyclist or watch a swimmer or watch obviously some track athletes. And we've got no choice of sports. So when you've got a little girl that wants to be sporty, if you're not showing her half a dozen sports. So, I don't want to go down that route where we only end up with one sport that everybody sees. I think we need to give a number of sports so that people can find what they like to do and do it, and that's definitely less than it used to be.
Last couple of minutes, Sharon. Who should we look out for on the GB swimming team at these Paris Olympics, which are opening this weekend? We had 8 medals back in Tokyo at the Olympics, 4 of them gold. We just had a great world championship. How are our swimmers going to get on in the pool? And of course, also the divers and the artistic swimmers too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they'll be aiming for at least 8 again, hopefully. Yeah, possibly even 9. I mean, Adam Peaty is going for his 3rd consecutive gold.
He is a machine.
Exactly. He's going to be up against a very, very tough Chinese guy, though, and who will be coming back on him like a train. So the last 10 metres will be very nerve-wracking. Ben Proud, one of the fastest men in water, he's going to be going for the crown in the 50 freestyle. Matt Richards, world champion in 200 free. And then, of course, you've got Duncan Scott, who is the Neely man. He's got a bucket full of Olympic medals, our most successful Olympian at the last games, but none of them are for an individual goal, which he desperately, desperately wants. I think our women are going to struggle a little bit because a lot of them are looking for 4 years' time, but Freya Anderson might be back in shape, so a 4x2 could be successful. Then you mentioned our diving. They've had the best world championships they've ever had recently, so, there'll be some fantastic medals in the diving pit. Open water, and we may even make history in the women's synchro pair. They could win a medal, which they've never done before. So I think aquatics was looking very good.
Beautifully done, Sharron Davies. Enjoy Paris. Thanks again for appearing for a 3rd time on Planet Normal. So there you have it, Allison. Sharron Davies' new book, Unfair Play, The Battle for Women's Sport, is out now. And it really is a fantastic read. I learned huge amounts about it, not just about the transgender debate. We've been following that closely. We've been following Sharon's progress on that very, very closely, but also about the Olympics and women's sport in general. It's a fabulous read.
Sharon has been such a hero, hasn't she? I would put her in the same sort of bracket as J.K. Rowling, really, throughout this period. You really see her competitive spirit, don't you? I mean, I don't know if listeners follow her on Twitter. Well worth following Sharron Davies on Twitter. Just absolutely up for it, really punching back against this sort of dismal stuff. And I think that, as you say, Liam, what comes through in the interview is Sharon herself was cheated as a young woman of the awards. And she spoke movingly, didn't she, about women who hadn't been able to get the correct medals in their lifetime because of the testosterone drugging of women in the Soviet Union and in East Germany. And now to see, not drugging under totalitarianism, but drugging in a free society of children, young men who then, as you said with the Leah Thomas case, totally unfairly stealing victory from female athletes. And something I've been very concerned about, Liam, as you know, was with the Labour government coming in, we can argue the rights and wrongs of welfare and benefits, as we have been doing higher up in the show. But the cultural things were always my concern with this. And indeed, Lisa Nandy, who describes herself as a moderate, has basically now is coming out and supporting trans women in female sport. And the policies of the Football Association and the ECB Cricket Board of allowing biological men to play in recreational women's teams. Now, we all know the physical dangers of that, but just the general sort of jeopardy of that. And someone like Sharon really that's what she's doing, is she's absolutely fighting this nonsense, which we believe on Planet Normal will come to be seen as one of the worst medical crimes against children. And also worth looking at, Liam, is Elon Musk gave a fascinating interview this week to Jordan Peterson, which Musk spoke about his son, who has transitioned, now entirely lost to him. He talks about him being dead. He talks about the fact that as a parent, he had no idea what his child was embarking on. So Sharron Davies playing a hugely pivotal role in this historic campaign.
You know what? I don't say this lightly. There is a huge amount of research in this book. Sharron has followed the science, the research very, very closely herself. She's worked with the well-known sports journalist Craig Lord. I learned a lot about the academic work in this area as well from this book. I think, why aren't people like Sharron Davies in the House of Lords if there's going to be a House of Lords? She'd be excellent. I mean, look at her life experience. Crikey, not world-class athlete, followed the politics of sport at the highest level her whole life, super brave campaigner, and somebody who, since she had that crushing disappointment, has acted with real integrity and dignity. Imagine not winning a gold medal because people have cheated against you. And she actually developed a really good relationship with the East German girl who beat her when she lost a medal in Moscow, Petra Schneider, of course. In fairness to Labour, they have put some kind of line in the sand in the form of Wes Streeting, Health Secretary, who is gay himself. He has very well thought out views, I think, on the trans debate, and he has to walk a tightrope within his own party. But the Labour Party, it has changed legislation, or it's talking about changing legislation when it comes to puberty blockers, hasn't it? Just being a bit more cautious, with Keir Starmer saying in the dispatch box during that PMQ, something which many in the trans community, or certainly trans activists, will find offensive. He said that evidence about whether or not puberty blockers are safe is not yet there. That's a big statement from the Labour leader.
I was very happy to see him respond to a question from Nadia Whittome about this issue and cite the Hillary Cass review. And I thought, good, that's, although the fact that one of his own ministers, Lisa Nandy, is taking another tack just is illustrative, isn't it, Liam, of the sort of potential rifts. I mean, this is early days. They're all still being kind of, wonderfully happy and delighted to have won. But it's not hard to predict that this is going to become a running sore as the years go by.
We take our cue from the States, don't we? And it'll be interesting to see as and when, or if and when, we should still say, but it's probably as and when, Donald Trump becomes president once again. Joe Biden stood down. The vice president, Kamala Harris, is up for the nomination. If Trump wins, will that change the attitude in the US towards transgender participants in sport? It's been in America, particularly in the America collegiate athletic system, which is, of course, is highly competitive, feeding into the Olympics, where you still have many instances of male-born competitors in female categories. Will that carry on under Trump? I'm not sure it will.
That's one reason I really want Trump to win, is because I think both Trump and his extraordinary actually pick for vice president, J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy.
Your new boyfriend.
Well, Vance's wife is an Indian lawyer, and she went to Clare College, Cambridge, which I also went to Clare College, Cambridge. So she's a bright girl. He is a sort of purger of woke. And Trump and Vance, if they came in, Liam, they would be wrestling out the innards of woke. From American academics should be very afraid, and rightly so, because the things that have been allowed to develop on campus, the appalling indoctrination of children, all that would change. And I've said on the pod before that, I have a lot of reservations about the Donald as a man. Now, there's all this, obviously, lot to be said about the mysterious disappearance of Joe Biden, who until very recently was said to be totally compos mentis. And do you remember, Liam, that every time somebody on our side of the aisle would say, yeah, he seems to be mentally incompetent, there would be a right-wing conspiracy theory, dreadful. He's absolutely sharp as a tack, which obviously that wasn't true. So they were lying about that. And now they are shoehorning Kamala Harris, his extremely unimpressive vice president. Looks like she will be the candidate. She's pretty much been endorsed by the people like Gavin Newsom and so on, who would have been expected to go up against her at the Democrat convention. Now, there have been 45 male presidents of the United States, and I would really love, I think it's just so strange that Israel's had a female leader and India's had a female leader and Pakistan and Bangladesh and America, the great democracy, has not had a female leader. But I absolutely do not want Kamala Harris to be the first woman leader of the free world. There's a thing you can Google, Liam, which is basically stupid stuff Kamala Harris has said. I mean, this woman she is the all-you-can-eat buffet of word salad, that woman. I mean, honestly, can barely express herself. And I think to have had Joe Biden, barely coherent, fraudulently imposed on people when his mental capacities were so poor, and now to have another Emperor's New Clothes moment with, it's great to have a black woman as American president. Why is it great if there are many, many hugely impressive American women of color and white women? I just don't want this dud to be the first female president.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We love to read your thoughts and learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
We've had a huge response, Liam, to my Tales of Woe in A&E. Jeremy says, I've worked in the NHS as a doctor for 35 years, 22 as a consultant, and it is a system that just doesn't work. But now it's just full. European colleagues used to laugh and poke fun about the NHS, me being a British cancer specialist. Jeremy, you won't be getting this cancer drug for a few years, huh? For many years now, those foreign colleagues don't laugh. They simply do not believe how bad UK healthcare is. People with critical coronary artery disease have to wait a year for surgery. Such surgery should happen within hours or a day at worst. Non, c'est pas possible, say my French colleagues. I would be a fool not to wish Wes Streeting success, says Jeremy. But the reality is the NHS is utterly useless, and it will take at least 20 years for us to get a proper European universal healthcare system. He hasn't a hope. You have my utter sympathy, Allison. Hope you're getting better. I am, Jeremy. Thank you. And Clive says, Alison's brilliant account of a time in A&E totally highlights our pathetic bloody NHS. They account for 11% of GDP, are the 6th best funded in the world, and are still completely useless. And I still haven't heard any politician ask the question, why, if we put so much in, do we get so little out in comparison, for example, with, say, Australia? None of our politicians have got the guts to even ask the question. Please keep it up, Planet Normal.
Great emails there. This is from Penny. Dear Alison and Liam, in regard to your discussion about proportional representation with Professor Matt Goodwin, that was last week, the Australian electoral system, says Penny, of preferential voting would be perfect for the UK. In Australia, we still have single-seat constituencies, both at the state and federal government level. However, voters vote for all the candidates in their constituency in order of preference. Voters like it as they can make a point without wasting their vote. The main parties benefit from second and third preferences. Also, political parties and the media pay very close attention to where first preferences go. Very interesting. I do think there's going to be a debate about our voting system, though I do think Labour are in such a powerful position they won't do anything about it. And Ralph to the rocket ship. Co-pilot Liam said the famous raising the flag on Iwo Jima was staged. I did indeed. I too thought the picture of Trump under the flag, fist raised as the pole shielded by the SS resembled Rosenthal's photo of the US Marines. But the photo was not staged, as Liam said. This is a common error here back on Planet Woke, which Joe, who won a Pulitzer for the pic in 1945, spent the rest of his life trying to correct. Well, I stand corrected. Very interesting. And thank you for the email, Ralph. Thanks for the show. Ralph concludes, lovely to hear a bit of sanity in this ever crazier fiat money world, one which will end when the fiat bubble pops its last. Cheers, Ralph. And the fiat bubble, that's a reference to quantitative easing and lots of money printing and inflation.
I was going to ask about that.
The fiat bubble, it's not a kind of new racy 1.1 litre runaround. Oh, I've got the new fiat bubble.
That's what I thought it was. You haven't taught me all you know yet.
That's a Fiat Panda.
This is from Nigel in Sweden. Liam and Allison. My comment on the Telegraph's leading article on the COVID inquiry. Yes, Nigel, we had a sort of preliminary report, didn't we, Liam, from our increasingly ludicrous and drawn out and oh so cheap COVID inquiry. Nigel says, Lady Hallett said the 2011 pandemic strategy was beset by major flaws, which were there for everyone to see. And she criticised Mr. Hancock for abandoning the strategy, one of many contradictory, inconsistent conclusions by Lady Hallett, says Nigel. A useful one-page report on the UK's handling of COVID could have been produced without cost as follows, says Nigel. 1, follow the Swedish example. 2, listen to the relevant episodes of the Telegraph's Planet Normal podcast. I offer this advice free of charge. Well, that would have saved a couple of £100 million, wouldn't it? Can I just say, Liam, on this topic and to Nigel, that one of Lady Hallett's observations in that initial report was that they were planning for the wrong epidemic. The influenza was not a good model to base it on. And now, Professor Sunetra Gupta, distinguished professor, professor of epidemiology, Sunetra has said to me several times that the flu was a perfectly acceptable sort of proxy for whatever was coming. So what Lady Hallett has said is, and won't be the last instance of complete nonsense.
And finally, Allison, this is from Neil. Has Ed Miliband completely lost his marbles? With minimal assessment, he's approved a planning application for a 2,500-acre solar panel farm on prime farmland, thus risking our food security. Where will the solar panels be sourced? He has had a stroke, cancelled numerous licences for gas and oil drilling against the advice of his officials, thus placing us at the mercy of global markets, when even the Climate Change Committee, hardly rabid climate change deniers, has said we're likely to need fossil fuels until the end of the century. All this has done is offshored our CO2 emissions. I don't imagine that Rachel Reeves will be thrilled at the loss of the tax revenue from the oil companies. So much for economic growth. Still, I suppose it's worth it. So clueless Ed constructs his prescience and hubris in front of his fellow global elites and eco-zealots, writes Neil. Keir Starmer must rein him in or remove him before he causes more irreparable damage. Regards, Neil.
Yeah, just a quick observation on that vast solar farm on the Suffolk-Cambridgeshire border. Lovely. Professor Pete Edwards, Professor of Inorganic Chemistry at Oxford, hugely eminent. Pete has been telling me for some time, Liam, that these lithium battery solar farms, at some point there is going to be an absolutely terrible fire that they will not be able to put out, and the local fire service in that area where Ed has approved the 2,500-acre solar farm, they recommended strongly against it. And Pete's recent final word to me was Newmarket will have to be evacuated. So you heard it here first on Planet Normal. We await the first major solar farm fire in the United Kingdom. Good luck with putting that out.
And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week, it's Allison's turn.
And it's going to be Penny with her very interesting email about proportional representation in Australia. If you enjoy Planet Normal, please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, because the co-pilot and I do love to read all the delightful reviews. It doesn't half cheer us up.
It does indeed. And some news before we go about our summer holidays, dear listeners. Next week, and for the next 3 weeks, in fact, we're going to be bringing you some compilations of the best of Planet Normal over the last year, our discussions and interviews.
That's right, Liam. But you and I will be back from our holidays, tanned, sane, well, relatively in my case, fully refreshed, raring to go, never to visit accident and emergency again, with normal Planet Normal service resumed on Thursday, the 22nd of August. Please do listen to our fabulous compilations in the meantime.
And as we speed away from our beloved planet Normal and the madness of planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers Isabel Bajard, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other until next week, or until August the 22nd. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.